You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Today we'll discuss the ongoing tragedy of the clerical sexual abuse. We'll examine its contributing factors and its consequences. Our special and welcome guests are Jane Adolphe and Robert Fastiggi. They are co-editors of Clerical Sexual Misconduct, a Foundational Conversation. Adolph is professor of law at Ave Maria School of Law in Naples, Florida, and former expert of the Holy See Secretariat of State section for the relation with states. Dr. Fastiggi is chair of Dogmatic Theology and Christology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary, Detroit, Michigan. He is a member of the Pontifical Marian Academy International. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation through Christ our Lord. Amen. Professors Jane and Robert, if we may, could you begin by telling us how you came to be co-editors of this terribly important book?
Well, maybe I'll start. So I was working as a expert for the Holy See inside the Secretariat of State, second section, and that's with relations with states. And I was doing work on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Holy See has to, according to its ratification of that convention, submit reports. And so one of the elements of the reports was following sexual abuse cases due to that convention and what the Holy See had to report. And I guess it was in 2018, or maybe even, I think it was in January 2018. It was right after the Me Too movement, and I had asked my superiors, or basically suggested that we do something about sexual harassment in the church, in terms of policies or something, even in the Roman Curia, but I didn't think it was going to be a clerical male on female issue. I thought when it hit the church, it was going to be a male on male issue. And I don't think they knew what to do with that comment. And then these situations hit the paper, and it was in Chile where you had a kind of a situation with seminarians, and a Bishop Barros had been appointed by the Holy Father, and three victims that were seminarians, former seminarians, had said that he was present when he was abused by a certain priest who had been punished by the Holy See by that point. And then the situation happened a few months later with Honduras. And Honduras, it was a situation of seminarians complaining about a homosexual subculture. A seminarian had attempted suicide after he broke up a lustful relationship with another seminarian. And then the third case that hit the papers that same year was the McCarrick scandal. And at that point, I advised the Holy See, because I was wearing two hats as a professor and as an expert for the Holy See, that I was going to do a conference in Naples, Florida. And I asked whether the Holy See wanted to participate. The Holy See referred me to the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. But what I wanted to study was not only minors, but male violence in the church on minors, seminarians, and young adults. And that's what we did. And the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors did send us a statement. We read it. It's published in the book. And at that point, Robert has been working with me for the International Catholic Jurists Forum since I think it was created in 2014. And I couldn't have done the book without Robert because Robert participates on all these activities, and he's able to bring in theologians and to really fill out this interdisciplinary mission that we have. And so I invited Robert. He came, and we did the conference, and then him and I believe have been working on various proceedings of various conferences.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an excellent background for us to begin with. Robert, anything to add?
Well, I just feel blessed to be a collaborator with Jane and others on this very important issue. It's a dark issue. It's troubling, but I think God is calling the church to a purification. And I never thought I'd be teaching in a seminary as a layman, but I've been teaching since 1999. And I feel like a father to these young men who come in. And at least at our seminary in Detroit, I see such wonderful young men. But even since my time, there have been some seminarians that I taught who got in trouble. And so you just wonder how this could happen. But I'm so glad that the issue is being faced. I don't think we should at all try to hide it. And the secular press has brought it forward, first, in Boston, but there were cases even before that, before 2002. But I think the bishops have responded well in terms of protecting minors. But now there's the whole issue of predatory behavior of priests towards women and men who are legally adults, but in vulnerable situations. And we have the recent case of Father Rupnik, a great celebrated artist, and has written books about discernment. But it's come to light that he's an abuser and was excommunicated actually for a while. So I think it's important to have faith and trust in the Holy Spirit and trust in our Lord Jesus and the Blessed Mother and Saint Joseph. And I've often said that I think the ultimate solution will be spiritual. We have to do things practically and protect people. And there's good documents out there, but the documents have to be implemented. And they could only be implemented if people are willing to implement them. And so there's some real problems in the church. Like Jane mentioned, homosexual subcultures. I think we have to be honest about some of this, but it's coming to light, and we just pray that there will be a purification.
Thank you. I'm glad that you both have mentioned the abuse of adults. I know one of our regular audience participants was very interested in that question, and perhaps we can return to it. Mm-hmm. Mario, what next here?
Well, I think that the topic is very emotional in many ways. one of the questions that people ask, and also I ask myself very often, is that what were the main factors that contribute to this abuse? I know there may be many over the years, not only what you said in Boston, but before that. Mm-hmm. What would be, you can illuminate us about those factors?
Yeah. Well, I wonder, the book itself, just to give you an overview before I answer that question, the book is really divided into 4 sections. And the first part is dealing with the social, basically the empirical data on male violence. And then the second part deals with contributing factors, extra-church and inter-church influences. The third part deals with legal and policy issues. And the fourth part is very hopeful because it deals with charting the course forward, biblical, theological, and pastoral reflections. On the contributing factors, extra-church and inter-church influences, Monsignor Piotr Mezkiewicz, who's with the Cardinal Wyszynski University in Poland, did a great article on the roots of the clergy sexual misconduct. He gets into Marxism and a various amount of factors, ordination of priests with deep-seated homosexual tendencies, or those that have embraced the gay culture. He also talks about Eucharistic problems, a lack of respect for the Eucharist. And he goes on and gives a long list and includes various Marxist thinkers that have infiltrated the church with their thinking. There's also an issue of Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s. He's basically created a sexology, which is basically something that has been debunked by Judith Reisman, bless her soul. She died during the COVID outbreak, and she had spent her life basically revealing the flaws in this guy's sexology expertise, so-called, to the point that she argued that he was actually a criminal because of his research on children. And so there's a number of factors, and I recommend that chapter. And another chapter that was done in that part was done by Russell Shaw on clericalism. And he had spoken about clericalism as an element of it, as not respecting the personal vocation of laypersons. And he basically said that this is one of the things that can be used to cover up situations where you hide the priest, you do not report him, and it's not the cause per se, is what his argument is. More of the causes would be that, or contributing factors that Monsignor Piotr had talked about. And the chapter that I wrote was really a comparative chapter between Cardinal McCarrick and the 2 major predators in the United States, Larry Nassar for the Olympic team, gymnastics team, and Sandusky, who had been an assistant coach at a very influential football program, and he was molesting children under 10 and over 10. And Nassar, it was women, girls and women. And what my findings concluded is that we had a lot in common with other institutions, a lot in common. And that's tragic because we have to do better as the Catholic Church. But you can't call everything at the Catholic Church is clericalism. Mm-hmm. And that was one of my findings. And the second one is I went through the report of the Australian Commission on the Church. And although it had some insightful things to say, I noted that this commission has a different understanding of anthropology, human sexuality, doesn't understand that the church is a visible and invisible faith community, looks at it more as a non-governmental organization, and made its recommendations. And my comment on that was we can't be relying wholly on these secular commissions. We have to be doing our own work with our own people. And certainly some of these commissions have something good to say, but we can't wholly leave it in the hands of secular persons. And so that's basically that section of the book in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Mario, follow up?
Well, what is interesting are the roots, intellectual roots of those factors. But it seems to me that if you are Catholic, you just enroll in a Catholic institution, you may be receiving a Catholic worldview. And so your formation is following a particular pattern. You may be open to other views, but still you are being formed in the tradition of the church. Now, I know by a fact that many institutions, when you go, the formation you get is not precisely the Catholic one, rather the a different one, let's put it this way. And so, and I think that continues in many institutions. So how then we can claim that we are preventing this from happening when the just intellectual roots are still there and they are flourishing in many places? Mm-hmm. What is your reaction to that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because I've wondered about it myself. To what extent has bad theology, especially bad moral theology, contributed to this? And I think to some extent it has. Now, a good number of the abusers were trained before Vatican II, and they were in what we would consider, very conservative environments with basic good theology. But then when the doors opened and things started to, when there was this newfound freedom and indulgence, then maybe their inhibitions went away, and they acted upon some impulses to sin, to abuse, which might have been there, but it kept intact. So I know I wrote a chapter about clerical continence and celibacy, and there's some people who react. Well, they say, well, the problem here is celibacy. If these priests had been married, they wouldn't be doing this. But I don't think that's true. Celibacy is a beautiful thing, but someone has to be committed to it and be disciplined. And we don't have comparative studies of groups that Christian communities, churches that have married priests, have married ministers, but there's abuse that takes place there. I mean, we just look in the secular world. Most abusers are often married people, married men, married women, stepfathers, boyfriends. And so it seems simplistic to blame it on celibacy. The statistic that bothered me about the John Jay report was that 81% of the victims were male. And most of them were not prepubescent. So they were 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And so there's that some of these priests were really homosexual predators. Now, I know Archbishop Chicluna, when he was asked about this in a conference, said, I don't want to blame, I would never want to blame one single group, but the statistics are there. And I don't think a healthy heterosexual man would want to prey upon an adolescent boy. But Father Sullins wrote about this, and I know it's unpopular, and it seems to be different in the Catholic Church as opposed to other places where the majority of victims often are female. But there are female adult victims and vulnerable adult male victims who are grooms, seminarians. So I think at first it was protection of minors, but now it has to be protection of vulnerable adults. And I think I think Cardinal O'Malley is aware of that, and also Pope Francis is aware of it. But I don't think we'll ever be able to have to eradicate every case of sin and abuse in the Catholic Church. I mean, sin has been with us a long time. And, in the 11th century, you have St. Peter Damian writing the Pope and outlining all of these horrible things that priests were doing. So it's nothing new. St. Paul had to give warnings to the Corinthians who were living, living a kind of still hypersexual life, even though they had received the Lord and been baptized. So we'll never, the Church, as Vatican II says, is holy, but always undergoing purification. Sancta simul et semper purificanda. So we keep that in mind, but we have to be on the side of purification and not on the side of hiding the sins and covering them over. I think there was clericalism did play a role, or some bishops or religious superiors. They were just, the first thing in their mind was not the victims, but it was the institution or their reputation. And this is really wrong. I know one very good bishop, Bishop Boyer. He said whenever a bishop has to talk about sex abuse, the first concentration has to be on the victims. And I think, like most dioceses now, at least in the United States, which they do have a mechanism to report cases of abuse. And I just was looking this morning at, there's a yearly report. This was over 80 pages of very wordy, but from the U.S. bishops, they have an audit, but they show the number of reported cases of abuse or complaints, and then there's a smaller number, much smaller, of those that have been confirmed. So what some people have brought up the issue of priests who have been unjustly accused, but then it has to be investigated. Well, I know of a few priests who have been unjustly abused. And we think of the case of Cardinal Pell, and it must be a terrible thing, but we have to consider the potential victims. So it's better to err on the side of caution. That would be my understanding.
One thing I just like to bring up, when Archbishop Scicluna at that point had made that comment, it was right prior to a summit that they had held in Rome in February of 2019. We had concluded our conference in September. We had then done summaries of all of the papers. They had been published as an insert in the magazine inside the Vatican magazine. Robert Manahan had made sure that the magazine, copies of it electronically, had been sent to every president of the Episcopal Conference in the world to ensure that they had that for the February meeting and to deal with homosexual conduct at this meeting. And those responsible for the meeting concluded that, no, we're not going to get into specifics. We're going to basically concentrate on getting the straggling Episcopal conferences to get their safe environment program in order, something that they had requested years previously. And quite frankly, that's a good objective. And I believe that the themes that they discussed was transparency, responsibility, and accountability. But they would not deal with the homosexual question. The question that was put to Archbishop Scicluna in the news room, or one of the press briefings they had, was this question of homosexuality. And his response was that we don't want to blame groups. Well, I find that comment a little bit disingenuous, because we know that the Church has had no problem talking about this as pedophilia for just years. Mm-hmm. And that's a group of persons. And the reason why it's pedophilia is because you've made a conscious decision to separate those suffering with pedophilia from those that are acting out homosexually. And that's a political decision, because it does not, number one, go with the statistics. And number two, there's no reason for the church to be using the word pedophilia or any other medical term. We're looking at the acts. The acts are homosexual. Even if the man was to touch a little boy under 10, that act is homosexual.
Yeah.
So why is the church using it? Well, politically, it's because those that are engaging in homosexual conduct do not want to be put in the same category as those that are suffering from a mental disease in the DSM manual.
Yeah.
Okay? So we shouldn't be engaging in politics here. We have to be dealing with the salvation of souls of the persons that are engaging in this conduct and the victims, children, prepubescent, post-pubescent, all of the children from in the womb up into 18 and on. So I think that that's something that we should talk about, because pedophilia is not the term to be used in these cases. It should be child abuse, because in the church it's under 18.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jane. I remember that I saw a video of that conference, and I think it was Sandro Magister. Mm-hmm. I think he was speaking in Italian. Well, and in Cicluna is good in English and Italian. So, but I remember the response: "Oh no, we'll never, I will never try to blame one group." And there are homosexual people who live chastely. It can be done. But if you have a subculture in a seminary or a religious institute, it creates problems. And the statistics show that homosexuals themselves admit that they enjoy having sexual relations with younger partners. I mean, this is statistically verified. These are difficult cases. We don't want to blame, a whole group, but the church has been pretty clear about this, including Pope Francis, that those who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies should not be promoted to the diaconate or the priesthood. And that was, reaffirmed by the Congregation for Clergy, and before that, the Congregation for Catholic Education. But now seminary formation is under the Congregation for Clergy, and in their document, the Ratio Fundamentalis, translated as the gift of priestly vocation, they reaffirm that those with deep-seated homosexual tendencies should not be promoted to ordination, first to the diaconate and then to the priesthood. There's always people say, well, what do you mean by deep-seated? Well, I guess psychologists could answer that, but I mean, if it's dominating the person, or we want people with a healthy masculine identity as priests, because they'll be fathers, spiritual fathers. So I think I don't like, you don't want to blame the chaste homosexual people, but we have to think of those who are vulnerable. And then there's a culture of silence too. But that's kind of breaking down. I mean, I know when I was a graduate student, 22 years old, a priest professor went after me, and then he apologized and had me promise not to tell anyone. I didn't tell anyone till I found out he was dead, years later. So I was kind of intimidated. So I think some of this goes on, and has gone on. Maybe it's breaking down. Seminary, if you have a predator in a seminary, a priest predator, the seminarians would feel intimidated. But there was a group in Argentina, Miles Christi, their founder, Iannuzzi, was preying upon seminarians. And I know these priests because they have a house in Michigan. And they said that unlike the legionaries of Christ, the priest members reported their founder, and they asked Rome to intervene. Do you know something about that, Mario?
I did. I do know quite a bit, but what is interesting in that case is that this, I don't know what is the canonical nature of that association or fraternity or whatever, but it seems that was very orthodox. Mm-hmm. The formation was faithful to the tradition of the church, was not what we may call liberal or left-winger, and yet the founder was involved in those abuses.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they claim that some ideas, theological ideas, which are not orthodox, are factors contributing to those phenomena. But in that case, it seems that those were not the contributor factors. I don't know, it's an interesting case, but the same thing we can say about the legionaries.
Yeah, yes. Maciel was, right. Young men were attracted to the legionaries because of their orthodoxy.
Right.
But I know a priest, he was born in Ireland, and he knew of the abuse going on, but no one would believe him. And so he went down to Mexico, and he was fluent in Spanish, and he met those who had left legionaries that he suspected were abused. And some of them were engineers, lawyers, and he took notes. And then he brought his findings to the Hartford Courant, and they published the article. Because I asked him personally, I said, how did those reporters get a hold of that material? And he just smiled. And he said, I know. And then he admitted he was the source. But he was, he said something that I'll never forget. He said 97% of those the priests and the Regnum Christi women are pure of heart. And he said it was just 3% corrupt at the top. And that's sometimes what happens, and we have to think also, yes, there have been some terrible cases of sexual abuse by priests. But think of the great majority of priests who live chastely, or at least strive for chastity. If they fail, they go to confession, and they're doing good work with God's grace. So they have been some priests I know, they say they're embarrassed. They wonder whether they should wear clerics in an airport because people will think they're abusers. So this is but you see, that's what sin does and abuse does. It hurts innocent people, even those who are not abusers. So we have to keep that in mind. But I think it's out in the open. Steps are being taken. There are good documents, but it all boils down to people. And the people who are forming priests have to be faithful, have to be chaste themselves, because we have to be models. Even I'm a layman, but I have to be a model to these future priests.
Right.
I have to show them the love of the church, the love of Christ, the love of the Blessed Mother of Saint Joseph. So I have to be faithful to my prayer life, and it's a great honor to teach them. I sometimes feel like I'm inadequate for this, but we rely upon the grace of God. And what inspires me is to see so many young men who, they're good looking. It's not like they couldn't find a wife, but they're just on fire with love of Christ. So I get encouraged by that. And so we could lose heart, but we have to think of the saints, they, one priest said every era of church history has terrible sinners, but also great saints. There's never been a century without saints. So I think of John Paul II when he wrote his apostolic letter, women cannot be priests ordained to the priesthood. He just said, really, we must remember there's the hierarchy in the church, is the hierarchy of sanctity. That's the real hierarchy. And Pope Benedict XVI, God rest his soul, when the Italian press was complaining about too many saints. They said the church is turning into a saint factory. He had a very good response. There can't be too many saints. That's the lifeblood of the church, is the Holy Eucharist and sanctity.
And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is right now on an international level, there is a promotion of gender ideology as the new world ethic, with those that are promoting a new form of governance, public-private partnerships. And this is the ethic. And to be included as one of the global partners, you have to embrace this ethic. And there seems to be some people in the church that want to promote, even though Pope Francis, there is a document about gender ideology, and Pope Francis has been very forceful against it, as was Pope Benedict XVI. We do have people in the church at very high levels, including cardinals, promoting this type of thing, and which includes, LGBTQ, and I think there's a number of other acronyms that they use, and it just keeps on growing. Now, and that gets to the idea of accompaniment. Well, at this point, you're starting to, at this point, we're at an important juncture, because we have to admit that 81% of the victims are male. Those statistics from the John Jay study has been reaffirmed in every commission that has been done at the state level or a grand jury reports. It always comes out the majority of them male. So at the same time that we have this going on, we now have a movement in the church to almost promote homosexuality as a good. And this is a cultural and legal trend that's now coming down from the top level of the Holy See and the Roman Curia. And that will affect how we can actually deal with this from the perspective of the salvation of souls from the abusers and the victims, and how we can protect the victims. And so that's something that's of great concern.
Yeah, it is concerning. This is where bad theology or bad pastoral practice will have an effect. And some people think, well, I have a friend who's homosexual, and he or she's very nice and so on. I see the goodness in them. But we should, a lot of them are deeply tormented people. One Catholic priest who was a psychiatrist, I use the term constellation. Usually homosexuality, deep-seated homosexuality, is part of a constellation of other problems. But now we have gender confusion because of the breakdown in the family. Mm-hmm. That a lot of young people growing up, they don't even see a good model, a good father or a good mother, or sometimes they don't even see good grandparents. Sometimes when the marriage breaks up, they're parents, but then they could see sometimes grandparents come in. Now that's not even the case anymore in some places. So it's a real serious issue. We just have to, what is the solution? To teach the truth, to be faithful to the truth. And we have to try to be as faithful individually as we can and teach the truth. and pray for bishops, pray for more vocations to the priesthood. I really support celibacy, but we have the Eastern rites. Yes, there could be good married priests in the Eastern rites. We have my colleague Oana Gotsias, she's from Romania. Her father was a priest and her grandfather was a priest. So this could happen in the Eastern rites. But I think that the world needs that witness. Our culture needs that witness of those who are healthy, happy, celibate, and holy. That's what we really need. There's something very powerful about it. If you meet a religious sister who's pure, there's something very powerful about this. We have this, the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist in Ann Arbor. So every other year I teach them Mariology. I go in and I see these 30 young women, but I feel their purity. It's almost palpable. And the sisters who are forming them, they're just happy, joyful. And then, so the solution is marriage is a sacrament. It's a way of holiness, but also consecrated celibacy or virginity is a great witness. We need it now, I think, more than ever. We just have to pray more.
This exchange has been just so rich and productive. And all I can offer is a laundry list of comments. Perhaps you could put up with them in no special order, except for maybe going from the more recent comments to the earlier comments. When we accompany people, the question is, what will we say to them? What will we say to them? And so often there's a term that gets highlighted. And after it gets highlighted, it gets repeated, and it gets repeated until it becomes almost meaningless. And I think this notion of accompaniment is one of them. Jesus accompanied the disciples on the road to Emmaus, but he had plenty to say, and we need to know what we have to say. And of course, what we have to say is always what the truth is. And then mention has been made of what should I call it? I'm not even sure. Strange, almost addled comments by leading churchmen. We have this idea that somehow science has shown that homosexuality is perfectly licit and morally okay and even a gift. Well, of course, science shows no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so often these pronouncements are made, and the people who make them refuse to give any kind of supporting argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes they refuse to give any kind of supporting argument because they don't have one. They don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
And so the chapter, just if I could just...
Sure.
Yeah, the chapter by Dale O'Leary is really a chapter in the first section, and it's about addressing all of these myths. And she goes back to read actually the books of those that are acting out homosexually and what they have to say of what happened to them when they were young people.
Yes.
And it's a pretty powerful chapter, I think.
Yes. And then there's also this habitual kind of line, the Holy Father is aware of this. I recently read, this was just a couple of days ago, the Holy Father is aware of the treatment of the Uyghurs in China. Well, so is any intelligent adult who reads the newspaper aware of it. Being aware of it really raises the further question, well, why aren't you speaking about it? Why aren't you speaking about it?
No.
And then Mario knows that I'm allowed one rant per show. Sometimes he tries to get in two, but I am officially allowed one rant per show. I suppose when we're looking for factors, deep down is the Latin truth. Tamquam leo rugiens. Your enemy, the devil, goes about like a roaring lion. Mm-hmm. And to his credit, Francis hasn't been hesitant to mention that. Mm-hmm. And then when we explore all these issues, another expression comes to mind, and this is from a great mentor of mine, Elizabeth Anscoe. Mm. And she, from time to time, would refer to the endless twistiness of the human mind, which is, I suppose, a way of saying that the fall includes us, the endless twistiness of the human mind. But three other things, if you could bear with me, and then I will forever, at least for 5 minutes, hold my peace. I don't see that Marxism has, you mentioned Marxism early on, I don't see that, apart from, of course, Marxism's utter failure to address sexual ethics in any kind of constructive way, I don't know that Marxism really has much to say or much involved in what happens in the United States among the clergy in the United States. And then, to my ears, while I recognize what clericalism amounts to, it's a kind of suck-up syndrome that manifests itself in a certain smarminess on the part of all involved in the suck-up syndrome. Here in the United States, in academic life, in my academic life, it's not so much clericalism that comes to the forefront, but it's a rigorous, hostile anti-clericalism, sharp and continued anti-clericalism. And I'd like to have some acknowledgement of that. I mean, things are such a ferocious, fetid, how's that for alliteration that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, a fetid mixture of things. It's really hard to sort them out. And then let me end with this. Just in the last maybe 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a lot of attention shown to, and Stephen White, Catholic University of America, has been very good on this, and I think he's a very astute commentator. Stephen White has done a comparison of abuse in the Chicago public school system and abuse in the Catholic Church, and how while we grieve over the abuse in the Church, we've been so much better at addressing it than the Chicago public school system has been. And a few people will make that point, a few here and there, but it won't be center stage in the media. The closest we've gotten to any kind of media honesty with regard to this is the terrible, terrible failure of the Boy Scouts of America in this regard. At any rate, it's a laundry list of comments that I just made, but every once in a while I offer such. Mario, would you like to get us focused again?
Well, after this rant, okay.
That's not a capital R; it's lowercase r.
My reaction is, what do we need to do? Of course, it's conversion, spiritual change and everything. But that's my reaction. That's my own experience when I want to get acquainted with a priest. I always have in the back of my mind, well, I'm not sure these priests will be trustworthy. And that experience I didn't have when I was growing up. Today, to be honest, sometimes I wonder about that. So what do we do?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. I don't think these solutions happen overnight. You know, it's going to take time, and for Benedict XVI used the word rot. You know, there's rot in the church, so it's going to take a while. And I would quote Bishop Boyer again, because he was the dean of studies who hired me, but now he's the Bishop of Lansing, Michigan. But there was a diocese in Michigan where the bishop really undid so many good things. I won't mention the diocese. And he says, who's ever sent there has to begin the process of building a foundation so the next generation could begin to reform. He says these things don't happen overnight. So, but sometimes out of evil comes good. You think in Mexico, we talked about anti-clericalism, but there was the terrible persecution of the church, and probably Freemasonry was behind it. But then in Guadalajara, there was the center of the Cristero movement, the resistance. And so I was very happy to read last June, the Archdiocese of Guadalajara had 70 men ordained to the priesthood in one day. Mm. And I'm wondering why, what is, I think it's just all those who stood up and defended the faith, many of them martyrs, many of them persecuted, they're praying. I don't know how else to explain it, but in this day and age, it was so many that there had to be two separate ordination masses because the archbishop couldn't ordain them all. I mean, some dioceses would be happy to have 70 seminarians in all different classes, but this was one class. So there are signs of hope, but I think there's a connection between the people there who defended the faith, and then generations later, it bears fruit.
Hey, so Viva Cristo Rey.
Yeah, Viva Cristo Rey. So I just, because I know, well, maybe Mario knows more. He would probably know more about this, but I think Guadalajara was the center. That was really the center. And I knew a professor in Texas, a history professor, and he went to Guadalajara and he asked to see the archives there. He wanted to see if there was a Freemasonry connection with the anti-clerical atmosphere. And so he was given permission, and then he went in and it was all uncatalogued and everything. There was all this Freemasonic literature. And he asked the archbishop, why don't you categorize this? He said, because there's something more to it. Those were probably the literature that people were asked to turn over in confession. They had gone to confession, and that was one of the things to turn over, to get rid of their Freemasonic literature. So he just said in the archives, you could see it. It was just so much. So I think if it's not Freemasonry, it's gender ideology. The devil is going to find little new things to attack the church in every generation. But there will, if we resist, if we're faithful, we might not see the fruits of it in our lifetime, but I think it will bear fruit. Of course, I try to be an optimist. I have friends who are very holy, but they tend to be pessimistic. So
Mario is really old. I can't tell you how old he is.
No, but
there's someone who's before you this very moment who just recently turned 77.
Wow.
It's not Mario either.
Okay.
Oh.
He's 82.
Wow. Well, young.
Wow.
But he works out every day. It's really admirable.
Well, both we have to think Pope Francis is 86, and he's still going. But both of you look great.
Well, you better visit your eye doctor. At any rate, now here's another thing about the crazy mix of contemporary life. I don't doubt that Freemasonry hasn't been an insidious influence in many places. But to speak of Freemasonry in the United States, I think is silly. What we have is the shrine circus, and we have people wanting to join a club, and we have people who are more, what should I say, corny and interested in uniforms and what to do on Wednesday night than they are in any kind of plotting. So that always has to be, I think, factored into the actual context.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a threat in the United States now, but in certain periods of history, the Freemasons were behind very strong anti-clerical movement at the French Revolution.
Yes, that's the case. But here is, I think, mostly a matter of joke. I mean, we have something called the International Association of Odd Fellows, which proudly advertises itself as such. But I also have a friend, Greg Erlandson, who was the head of the Bishop's News Service, and he just retired. And he said whenever he'd make that point in Italy, or I should say he was just retired, whenever he made that point in Italy about conspiracies and so forth, his friends would take him aside and say, remember, it only took 30 people to kill Caesar. So maybe I'm naive. Mario, your fingers up.
Well, this is what I think. We often spend too much time in blaming others, which may be true, but we need to look at ourselves. What are we doing? Mm-hmm. And what I see is a collapse, catastrophic collapse of Catholic intellectual identity. Yeah. I always say, jokingly, there is no salvation outside Thomism. Well, how many bishops really know what Thomism is? Mm-hmm. Plenty of criticism against scholasticism here and there, and yet it gives us a framework from which we can understand theology, philosophy, canon law, history of the church, tradition of the church. As time passes, I'm more convinced about that. Mm-hmm. And so how in the world we want priests to be solid when they lack their foundation? And that has to do with their education, mm-hmm. Catholic education. Universities, which are claimed to be Catholic, are not in the sense they don't have these people who can provide a solid foundation. I'm not saying close to the Middle Ages. I'm saying a vibrant Thomism which can understand the issue of the day and thinking in a very reasonable way. Just a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks, I don't remember exactly, in Chile, one of the universities, not a Catholic university, it's National University, there was a master thesis defending pedophilia. Oh. Based on what? Will, human will. We decide. It's just not the view of law as coming out of human reason, like the traditional Aquinas view and Aristotle and so on. So the whole craziness of that sense of freedom where your will determine reality is out there. And the issue is not that is being taught at public places or public institutions. It also has filtered down into the Catholic institution. No. And so unless we start addressing this issue, I'm not saying it's the only one, but I'm saying it's key in order to understand how we can make claim against that ideology, another ideology, and we make competing claims. And to me, the model of that was Ratzinger. Ratzinger was the one who was engaging with Habermas, with any other thinkers, reasonably, without attacking them, without getting into a war. No. Reasonably, he was proposing this is the way that we think, and this is reasonable, and so on. So much so that many people, like Habermas himself, acknowledged how solid he was. And so that, I think, is the root that we have abandoned, or most of the, even Bishop, I would say, have abandoned. And so, and to me, that is not very encouraging, even though I think some people are doing that, in some lay thinkers are proposing slowly to recover this patrimony, which is, to me, is extraordinary.
Oh.
Well, that was my rant for today.
No, I fully agree with you. Thank you for that, Mario. I could report that in the new program for priestly formation, they do encourage the study of St. Thomas, both in philosophy and theology. Now, again, you could put it there in a book, but people have to, enforce it. You have to have people who know St. Thomas and love St. Thomas. And they, this year will be the 700th anniversary of his canonization. He was canonized in 1323. So there are some congresses that are being organized. There was a big one in Rome, but it's funny that Pope Francis, Pope Benedict XVI said he was more of an Augustinian than a Thomist. But when he gave his general audiences on St. Thomas, it was clear he understood him perfectly. Right. John Paul II was a Thomist, but he brought in some phenomenology, but he did it with such, always with the faith in mind. So, I mean, I have, if someone is a Bonaventurean or a Suaresian, but the faith has to be central. We have all these wonderful teachers of the faith and great mystics, but you're right. I think that we have such a great treasury of Catholic intellectuals. Maybe there are signs it's coming back. We have, but it's small. But the universities have to turn around. They compromised back in the late 60s with that Land O'Lakes document. I don't know. Even in Rome, I've heard reports of priests who've studied there. They said in the 70s and 80s, even the pontifical universities had dissidents teaching. And now maybe things have gotten a little better, but not at the John Paul II Institute, as Jane and I know. And my colleague, Oana, who was fired. So there's... there are some signs of falling back, and you think I've been doing research for this paper on dissent, but when you think about that birth control commission, Paul VI added all these people, and you had cardinals pushing for a change in church teaching. I think just the Holy Spirit got a hold of St. Paul VI, and he held the line. But Pius XII said this is a teaching that cannot change because it doesn't come from us; it comes from God. So, but then there were all these bishops, some of them quite prominent, including Cardinal Dearden of Detroit, Cardinal Sunens of Mecklenburg, Brussels. They were pushing for a change, but it didn't happen. But then the theological community just rallied around Father Curran and others, and to think that he was not going to be renewed in 1967, but times were changing. So he had so many students protested, and faculty shut down the university. The Catholic University of America shut down in 1967 because this popular young priest's contract was not going to be renewed. And yet he already was teaching that masturbation is not a sin, that contraception is okay. So we've had some frightening moments in church history, but we have to kind of regain the élan, as they say in French. It will happen.
One Catholic intellectual who had élan is pictured to Mario's immediate right. Oh no, he's blocking him. Move! Yeah, he's blocking him. Move! There he is. And then over here, we have him once again, the young Jacques Maritain.
Oh, yeah.
And Mario and I are Maritanistas, so we always like to mention him. But far more important than any of our intellectual efforts, although they are important, is the gospel itself. And we always close with the gospel for the day, and today it's from Mark. Jesus entered the synagogue. There was a man there who had a withered hand. They watched Jesus closely to see if he would cure him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Come up here before us." Then he said to the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath rather than to do evil, to save life rather than to destroy it?" But they remained silent. Looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, Jesus said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately and took counsel with the Herodians against him to put him to death. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
you.
James.
Thanks
you,
very
Mario.
much.
Excellent. Thank you.
Excellent background as these tragedies unfold in front of us. Godspeed to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
God bless.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.